Hola y bienvenidos a todos. Este es MMHC. I love to start out with Spanish because I know it's Eddie's favorite.
Right before we started, Justin said, I got something special for you. And I guess that's what it was. That was special. Thank you, my friend.
I want you to feel good. I want you to feel happy. I want to make you laugh.
Thanks. I appreciate it. That's why this works. That's why we continue to work. I appreciate it.
Yes. Well, we got an awesome episode for you guys today. But first, I want to check in with you, Eddie. Now that you've heard some Spanish, how you doing? How you feeling?
I'm good. We are, I guess, a little like personal like work story. We're in the middle of like intern interviews for next year. This last year, we decided we wanted a clinical intern to be at the high school with us. That's been amazing this year. So we're looking forward to trying to find another intern for next school year. Had a couple interviews today. We got interviews tomorrow and Friday. It's pretty cool because we ended up with, I think we're 8 interviews total. All 8 of the people that we're interviewing ranked us in this whole like internship fair ranking system. They ranked us as either their number 1 or number 2. So almost a quarter of the class ranked us really high. So that's super cool for us just at our high school, our counseling center. Yeah, I mean, work has been cool. I've been really happy at the high school. Things have been going well. So yeah, pretty good. How are you, my friend?
Doing well. It sounds like everybody wants to work with Eddie, though, up there in Portland. Did you guys get hit by the rain? I heard the storms on the Pacific Northwest were bad.
I mean, I think rain was okay on our end. Like, it was definitely like windy. There was a storm like right before I went home for Christmas. That was a little bit of a mess. Like, messed up my travel a little bit, but that was fine. And I think we talked about it last episode a little bit, but wind and, actually in California, the rain was coming down pretty hard. Thankfully my parents were fine. But like the coastal towns, I heard Santa Cruz, California. If you're from the Bay Area, if you're from California, you're very familiar with Santa Cruz because there's a commercial that plays like every spring and summer. It's like, at the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk in the warm California sun. Boardwalk! Yeah, exactly. So
Dude,
yeah, Santa Cruz unfortunately got hit. Apparently around $10 million of damages. So sorry, Santa Cruz, but like the commercial's catchy.
So catchy. And yeah, I grew up in Santa Rosa, California, and I heard that commercial all the time. I still sing that stupid jingle. It was that and Windsor Waterworks. I don't know if you guys had Windsor. Did you get the Windsor Waterworks jingle, or were you too far south in the Bay for that?
I think I was too far. And we also had our own Raging Waters was the South Bay Area water park. Yeah.
Makes sense. But man, yeah, good memories of Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk.
Yeah. You didn't tell me how you're doing. You gotta join in on this.
Doing great. We have our baby coming in March, and so we're just gearing up for baby, buying all the equipment, strollers, bassinets, baby cribs, reading all the baby books, and it's been fun, interesting, a little stressful, but so excited, so excited to be a dad.
Yeah. Baby Eddie is on his way. I'm so excited for him.
Baby Eddie is going to be a beautiful baby.
I also want you to know I will have zero disappointment when the baby's name is not actually Eddie. I just want that to be very clear to you, Dana, your parents that listen, Uncle Calvin. Like, zero disappointment. Do not worry about me.
I can't lead you on. We're not naming the baby Eddie.
Yeah, it's all good. Well, Justin alluded to it. I think we have a good episode. We're excited. I think we always have a good episode, but we're excited for today's episode. It's something that we have had kind of like on our list of episodes for a while. Something that we wanted to cover. We talked about it as we're kind of heading into December and getting ready for the new year. This was an episode topic we wanted to cover, but we wanted to talk about generational trauma. It's something that is probably a newer topic that gets talked about, something that hasn't been talked about or maybe even understood for a long time, but definitely something that impacts tons of people, groups of people, populations of people, a ton of people can be impacted by generational trauma. And if we don't understand like what the impacts are, unfortunately it can keep happening. So definitely we want to cover it, want to make it easy to understand and kind of go over some stories. But really the generational trauma, like a definition for it, is the transmission of the psychological effects of traumatic events from one generation to the next. So basically, trauma that goes from our grandparents to our parents to us that may potentially spill over to the next generation. A basic example of it is if someone experiences abuse from a parent, that person is more likely to be abusive to their children. Not the easiest example to talk about, but something that is very real, especially in our line of work. And this isn't just limited to physical abuse. It can also include sexual, emotional, and verbal. And verbal can be stuff like harsh parenting styles and shaming.
And to give you more of a concrete example, and we're going to talk a lot about the studies that have actually gone on in this area, it was largely based on societal traumas, big events that happen to people. But say someone was serving in World War II and they develop severe PTSD symptoms. They come home and family immediately notices that that person is not quite the same. The father becomes emotionally distant and establishes a pattern where he is unable to talk about any emotionally difficult thing. The dad explodes on the family when things go wrong or in times of high stress, so it feels like they're unable to talk to him about anything. The children grow up in this environment where sharing their emotions leads to their parents blowing up on them, and they learn over time to bottle their emotions to stay physically safe because they don't want dad to blow up on them. And then the children never learn to really express themselves in a healthy way, so they bottle their emotions and have similar explosions like their dad did when the pressure builds up and spills over. The children eventually have their own children who similarly struggle to express their emotions in the same way, and the cycle continues.
Yeah. You know, when Justin sent these notes and I was looking at his example, I'm like, this could be used for a ton of different examples, and not just like PTSD, just like parents that don't learn how to be like emotionally open or present with their children. It doesn't have to be like the extreme example of PTSD, but I feel like it's an example that I've heard like a ton over the last 5-6 years of being a therapist, of like mom and dad have a certain way of parenting or how they behave with their children that impacts how children perceive what is like normal in a family system, and then that transitions to or translates to how they are eventually with their own children or maybe even other people in their life.
Totally. Lots of potential examples. And, losing a child in a family system, bad car accidents, losing loved ones in general, people being in prison, people being in war. There's so many potential examples of things that could cause generational trauma and totally impact a family unit.
Mm-hmm. To give you some more examples, we're going to jump right into story time. I'll go first with my story. This came right away when we were talking about generational trauma, but I remember one day, and I might have talked about it on the show before, but one day in grad school, there was an article about, I think it was like physical punishment, so like spanking basically in families, and like, is this okay? Is this not okay? I think we now know there's a ton of examples and research as to why it's not okay and should not be used as a form of parenting. But I remember the question was posed to the whole class, like, are you for or against spanking your children? And it was like me and like two other people were like, I mean, it's not that bad. Like, I was spanked when I was a child. Like, it's totally fine. And then like the class was not having it. Like, they were not like thrilled with what we had to say, and like there was not a lot of support, which is completely fine. It was a good learning experience for me, and it's really been something that's been important for me, like moving forward as I practice and as a clinician, the thought of like, just because I went through something, or just because our parents went through something, or just because like different groups of people have gone through something, does not mean that like, and we talked about this recently, it doesn't mean that like the next group has to go through something to deserve respect or to deserve things in life. Like, just because I survived something, like, and that was the thing too, that was the argument, and it was the dumbest argument. Well, I got spanked, so I was totally fine. Not true, most likely. You got spanked, and you were not fine, and you do not deal with things the best, and that should not be something that gets translated or transitioned to the next group of people.
Yes, overall, official MMHC stance, no spanking. Doesn't really seem to, data-wise and study-wise, actually help that much, and just tends to make kids more likely to commit violence in the future. But that's beside the point.
Yeah.
My story, briefly, is I just recently did a rotation at a child advocacy center where they do forensic interviews on kids who have been the victims of abuse. And God, that was a heavy rotation. I heard some crazy things that made me just shudder and shiver and shake. But my first reaction to a lot of these situations was, I can't believe this creep would do something this horrible to a child. And the staff there at the Child Advocacy Center really helped me realize that that mindset doesn't really help that much. They tried to help me see that the perp, and I always love using that word, the perp likely went through a lot of abuse themselves. And the program worked really closely with law enforcement to punish people who had abused kids, because I think that's an important thing. You got to have punishments in place there. But they also worked with social services to be able to offer a lot of resources to the family and to the perp, such as therapy, psychiatry, educational resources, speech therapy, classes on problematic sexual behaviors, financial services, transportation. So their goal was to stop the cycle of abuse and give the family the resources it needed to heal from the trauma so that it didn't lead to generational trauma. And I thought that was so cool. I thought their mindset, their goal was perfect, and they just did such a great job of doing it.
Yeah, that's an awesome goal, honestly, to like, yeah, it's the cycle. It is, you talk about like the cycle of abuse, cycle of trauma, like there has to be somewhere where the cycle stops. And if we're just going to treat it the same way every single time, and we're not going to try something different, the cycle is going to continue. And like, there's no stopping it until you have like that stopgap like this, like having the goal of, okay, yes, there's repercussions, there's consequences, but we're also going to try and give you things that can be helpful for you in the future, and so that this cycle stops here. So it stops here with you.
Totally. And so many people, when they go through something really traumatic or really stressful, their coping strategy is to avoid it. They go through the defense mechanism of denial. They don't want to accept it. They don't want to face it, because it's hard. It's hard to face your traumas. It's hard to try and process what you have been through. But unless you do face that trauma, you try and process what happened to you, you're more likely going to commit that further down the line to people, to your children. Yeah. So we always advocate, please, 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 if you've been through something terrible and you need help working through it, please reach out for help.
Yeah. So real quick, this is like beside the point. The word perp, is that like perpetrator? Is that what we're going for?
Yes.
Okay.
I guess I didn't explain that.
No, you're good. Because the first thing I thought of was Criminal Minds. For years, I would watch Criminal Minds and not know what the hell they were saying. But it was unsub, right? Is that what the phrase was, or the word was? Like, I just needed to clarify. That's all. It's not even that related. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that, because I mean, there might be someone out there who's like, what the hell is a perp?
Yeah.
So when I started writing this episode, I thought this would be somewhat of a soft science with not a lot of hard data or evidence or studies, but I was really wrong. Full disclosure, we got a lot of our info from for this episode from an article from the American Psychological Association entitled "The Legacy of Trauma." We're putting the link in the description if you want to check it out for yourself. But it did a great job of detailing a lot of the papers and data and research that's come out on this topic.
For those that don't know, the American Psychological Association is the leading organization for psychology in the U.S. And the reason why I say it that way is last week I was giving a presentation in the health class here at Sherwood High, and I introduced the APA in such a manner. So really adds nothing to today's episode. I just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, so Moving forward with the article from the APA, how this all got started, how this field got started. People first became interested in this after the Holocaust, like one of the worst tragedies in human history. They were interested in how such horrific events would change family dynamics and the pervasive like psychological impact that it was bound to have on people directly impacted, and then the people directly after and the generations after. So in 1966, Vivian Rakoff, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, released one of the first studies on this showing high rates of psychological distress among Holocaust survivors, which sounds correct. Interestingly, families tended to develop different adaptation styles, such as like feeling like a victim, numb. Also, you can call this being emotionally detached. Rates of depression and anxiety and PTSD were higher in these families compared to the families that did not have trauma. And then the rates of depression and anxiety were particularly higher in the families where the parents adopted the unhealthy styles of being numb and a victim. And they theorized that children developed high anxiety to compensate for their parents who were not able to handle stress situations or high stress situations. Basically, the parentification of the children. So giving children, younger children who are maybe not ready for these responsibilities or these responsibilities that they have to have at their young age, basically giving them responsibilities that they were not ready for and that they had to just do and they had to undertake because of the impact that it had on their parents.
I see the most parentification of children in cases where parents have really bad substance use issues. So, for example, say a mom has really bad trauma. She never works with someone to develop coping skills or processing it. And her main way of coping with the trauma she went through was alcohol. And so I've seen parents who drink a lot of alcohol and spend significant amounts of time intoxicated. And then the children essentially have to learn to parentify themselves to be able to take care of themselves because their parents are unable to do it. So that's kind of what we're talking about with parentification of the children. Another major source of research in this area was with Amy Bombay, who studied the Indian residential schools in Canada, which, oh my gosh, so many reports over the past couple years of mass graves of just hundreds of bodies found underneath these schools. It's horrible what happened up there. And I mean, horrible what we've done in the United States too. But
Absolutely.
Reports show that these schools ripped children away from their mothers and their cultures and tried to teach them to be ashamed of their culture, their language, and their heritage. Studies showed that the children and grandchildren of that generation reported more psychological distress and more overall suicide attempts. So that's a really good example of that generational trauma. The generations that didn't even go to those schools had the downstream effects that still affected them and hurt their mental health significantly.
Yeah. You know, when we're getting ready for this episode, I was thinking of how, like, for some people, maybe these examples, like, wouldn't, I don't know, like, hit home or wouldn't feel like it's something that, like, impacts them. But if you are in the United States, maybe Canada too, probably other countries, but I guess I'm just speaking of the United States experience and me growing up in the United States. When we talk about generational trauma, we have to talk about the African American community, the Black community here. They have gone through a unspeakable amount of trauma in the last 400 or 500 years, whatever it is at this point, like that they have had to deal with, like with slavery and how this country was built. Like it almost unspeakable. It is unspeakable, just the amount of trauma that a whole group of people that have had to go through and how much that ripple effect has continued to this day and like still continues. I mean, the African American community, the Black community has gone through so much trauma and went through so much trauma in the early days of this country. They continue to face a significant amount of trauma to this day. I mean, it's almost daily in the news that the amount of trauma that the African American community faces in this country. You know, you hear white people make the argument that this was years ago, they should get over it. Fuck that. I haven't cussed yet today. That's the first time I'm gonna cuss. No, like there's no getting over it. Like there's no, like, I guess you hear the argument too of like, well, we weren't around, like what do I have to do with that? Well, it's like what you have to do with it is that you're still kind of helping to perpetuate these this discrimination, this unfairness that people have to deal with because of like the way that society is built, the way that our country has been built, and the way that our country has been for years, and the way that the country has been for a long time, and has now been like amplified over them. And this is anecdotal, but the amount that has been amplified over the last, I guess, 20 years of my life, that I've really seen like how black people in this country get treated so damn poorly. I guess the point is that we're trying to make is that it is incredibly hard to, quote, get over these severe traumas, these traumas, specifically slavery, extreme racism, things like lynchings that people had to see. I mean, slavery is not segregation. These are not things that, like, there are people alive today that still, and I chuckle because like it like really puts it into context. There are people who are alive today that were still around when like things like slavery, and honestly there could be an argument that like slavery is still a thing with the prison system, but that's for a different episode. Things like slavery, things like segregation were not that far off. There are people who are alive today who were around when it happened on both sides of it. It is a part of our long-term history as a country. It's also a part of our modern history, and it's very important that we acknowledge that, because it's not something that you can just get over when it's still a part of the country today. So these all that to be said, like this generational trauma leads to things like unhealthy coping mechanisms, leads to distrust of others from the last generation, leads to a lot of maladaptive ways to deal with stress and to deal with life. And it's important that we acknowledge that. We can't just push it to the side and say, get over it.
Yes, so very true. And we have to learn how to actively try and dismantle a lot of the systems in place that are preventing the healing of this. And I think systemic racism is also preventing the healing of the generational trauma that African Americans have been through. For example, there were many incidents of scientists using black people for involuntary medical research, which created a lot of distrust of medicine in the black population. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Tuskegee experiments on syphilis.
Yeah.
It was horrible what they did to black people without their knowledge. This was not voluntary research. So that kind of stuff, that you could argue is generational trauma, because I know a lot of black people today who are still like, I'm not so sure about doctors. I don't know if I can trust them, because of that trauma that previous generation went through. Not to mention the systemic racism that prevented black people from getting loans, building their wealth, and having the means to become financially independent and pulling themselves up out of poverty. I know we've talked about a lot of this a couple of times on the show, but that black people were specifically left out of the GI Bill. So they came back from World War II, and they didn't have a lot of the same opportunities that white people did in terms of loans, in terms of college degrees. They've had to work so much harder for everything they have. And this is why we have to support our African American communities. We have to try and heal that damage to what was done with them, and help them lift themselves out of poverty is a really good place to start.
Mm-hmm. Back to your point about the like distrust in medicine. I mean, just look at recently, like with COVID and like the COVID vaccine. Like a lot of people of color and families of color have a big distrust for medicine in this country, and there was a big push in these communities to try and like convince them that it's okay to take this vaccine and that things will be fine. But there was a pretty big barrier that they had to push through in order to get people to think and know that this was safe to take.
Whoa, great example. And that probably is one of the contributing factors as to why black people were more likely to die from COVID than white people, is because they were so much more resistant to get the vaccine.
Yeah, among other issues in this country, that definitely was one of them. So we've given a lot of historical examples and some of the early studies that were done. So we want to discuss a little bit about the mechanism of how generational trauma happens. The example we're going to use, the first one, is looking at the Rwandan genocide in 1994. If you've ever seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, which I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent. I watched this movie my freshman year of high school. Was not ready to see the movie. It fucked me up. Like, it was like the day before Christmas break or holiday break in high school my freshman year, and it like I'm so bad at watching movies where there's like I get like such like a emotional response when like people die in movies or like family issues happen and dude, I'm telling you, that movie messed me up, and I think I went through the whole day with like a pit in my stomach of like I feel sick, like this is not. Wow. Anyway, that's a tough movie to watch, but unfortunately, like it's tough, but it's like historical, like it happened, like it's not like obviously there's dramatization in movies, but it happened. So anyway, I can't remember the whole like premise. Justin, jump in about basically the Rwandan genocide, but if I remember, there was two groups of people. It was like the Hutus and the Tutsis. Am I on the right track, or am I? No, we're doing this on. No, okay, no, I wasn't wrong. I was not wrong. We're okay. I'm googling this. Yeah, nope, I was right. Boom, thank you. Okay. I had to look that up because I felt terrible if I was wrong. Okay, so let me give you the quick Wikipedia rundown. We're doing this live, like as we're doing this on the fly as we record. I love this. Okay, so the Rwandan genocide, it occurred between April 7th and 15th. April 7th and then July 15th of 1994 during the Rwandan Civil War. During this period of around 100 days, members of the Tutsi minority ethnic group, as well as some of the moderate Hutu and Twa, were killed by armed Hutu militias. And the most widely accepted scholarly estimates are around 500,000 to 662,000 Tutsi deaths. Oh, so it was I did say the correct, thankfully, because I would have really felt stupid. Anyway, okay, so we'll continue. That was going on, and during the Rwandan genocide, mothers who went through the trauma of the Civil War and the genocide, they had changes in their communication style. So the second generation, the children, they showed heightened poverty, greater family work burden, and compromised parenting because of this. And meanwhile, teens discuss how they felt the factors affected in their own lives. And then many said that poverty rendered them unable to attend school and forced them to work harder to help keep the family afloat. And there are theories that people developed survival messages, like you can't trust anyone during this time, and trying to protect themselves from other groups of people. So in a survival situation like war, this survival message might be true. Like it might be a way to keep families safe, to make sure that you don't end up in a dangerous situation. But if this message is passed on to children living in, quote, normal situations, so after the trauma has happened, it can create unhealthy habits that create distrust and fear. And then it can make people afraid to ask for help and rely on others and not know why, because we're passing on this message from generation to generation.
Yes, and thanks for diving a little bit into that genocide. I honestly did not know much about it.
I got you.
And wow, over 500,000 people were massacred. That is horrible. That is just horrible.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of psychological reasons why that trauma is passed down, or social mechanisms why that is passed down, but they are genetic too, which brings me to our nerd alert, which is the part of the show where we like to put on our sexy scientist glasses, and we usually talk about the brain on Nerd Alert. Today we're talking about epigenetics, which is nerdy enough. I figured it warranted a Nerd Alert. But we've all heard about genetics. So humans have, in total, I think it's fascinating that we know specifically how many genes we have. We got about 25,000 genes that we translate into proteins that make us human. So there's like 25,000 different things that make an entire human. I think that's fascinating to know. You have a finite number of genes, that 25,000 number. But how those genes are expressed can vary greatly. Your genes are under really tight regulatory control, but there can be change as to how tightly those genes are packaged and stored that alter how much they are expressed. So if genes are packed in really tight, it's harder to get to those genes to express them. But there are ways that your body can open those genes up, make them more exposed so that they turn into proteins more often. So how tightly or loosely they are packed is essential, or is essentially your epigenetics. So for example, if you're under a lot of stress, your body will release more stress hormone cortisol. In states of chronic stress, your body will loosen up those genes that package cortisol so it can crank up production more often and more quickly because the body thinks it needs more of that cortisol to survive. So genetics are obviously passed down between generation, but epigenetics, that machinery around your genes, also gets passed down. So if a mother has epigenetic changes that are causing excessive expression of, say, that cortisol gene, the children are more likely to overexpress cortisol as well. So studies have shown us that trauma doesn't change those 25,000 genes. Those are set. That doesn't change the genes, but it does affect the epigenetics, how those genes are stored and accessed for use.
Science. Bam.
Science.
What's that scene in, was it Jump Street, 21 Jump Street? Wasn't there like a whole thing where like Channing Tatum was like high and he, like goes up to the board and is like writing all these like wrong equations? And then he's like, science. It's completely wrong. That's damn. Yeah, I mean, it's important to think about. It's important that people know, because I think trauma is being discussed more and more often now. Again, anecdotal these days, and like more and more people are having like at least a basic understanding of trauma, and like how much it's not so much this like before I went to war and like I experienced trauma. Like trauma is perceived trauma. So if that's something that you perceive as traumatic, that in itself can impact the way that you behave and the way that you do things and the way you interact with your environment. That can impact you for your lifetime. During your lifetime, you could have children. With those children, that trauma, that perceived trauma you had, can impact the way that you interact with your children. That can impact the relationship you have with your children. Like it's wild. So like, man, it's important we talk about it, because if not, people don't know and people don't understand.
Yeah, and there's so many different mechanisms, and we talked about a few of them, that it does get passed down. That if you go through something really traumatic, there's so many different ways that it can impact generations down the line.
Yeah. So we gave you all the problems. You're hopefully wondering, what do we do? Well, you came to the right place. Hopefully you didn't stop listening, because this is what you can do. Here's some hopefully helpful information. Most of the evidence-based interventions that we have are based around supporting families. I mean, I think that's why it's so important. In therapy, in mental health treatment, in psychiatry, there is a family involvement and family component. These programs teach effective communication. It reduces family conflict, and it teaches kids coping skills and how to say things like no to drugs. All these things have been shown to be effective. It also appears to be important to have people connected to the community so that there is trust in the people around them. They feel safe to ask for help, and other people outside the family can suggest that the family get help and resources. This is really important. We talk about this a lot. Me working in a public school, we talk about the importance of students having a trusted adult in the building. Like if there's a trusted adult, there's a higher chance that they ask for help. If they ask for help, there's a higher chance that they get the resources they need. If there's students that don't currently have a trusted adult, we try and figure out how we can help them get a trusted adult. We do all these things to help build trust for students and help them get a trusted adult. That I think that the positive impact is going to be, it's going to be great. It's going to be really helpful, like moving down the line. Even just the fact that you all are listening to this and trying to understand it better is also an important factor in addressing generational trauma. You can't fix what you don't know and what you don't understand. Just having a better understanding already is going to have a better impact on people that you interact with in the future. It creates that ripple effect, and people that you positively impact, they can positively impact other people, and the people they positively impact can impact it goes on, and I can say it until I get tongue-tied. It is good and it is helpful.
I think you made a really good point about having a trusted adult or a mentor. There's actually been a lot of good data going into mentorship programs, into making sure that young people have someone that they can go to who they can trust, and how, especially in young transgender people where the suicide rate is so high in the transgender population, just having a single adult that they trust and that they can go to for help reduces their suicide risk significantly. So there's there's such an individualistic mindset in the United States where it's like, you got to do it on your own. You got to be self-sufficient. You can't ever ask for help. It's just so unhealthy, and we need to rethink the way our society is structured, which easier said than done, I know, but it is for the sake of everyone. It's for everyone's benefit that we start supporting people instead of just constantly trying to tear everyone down and trying to be so autonomous and individualistic. It's also important to be aware of some of the most significant historical traumas out there that people around you are going through, similar to what we mentioned too with African American people in this country. If someone experiences a trauma, give them a way to talk about it or work through it. Similar to what we were mentioning at the beginning of the episode with the Child Advocacy Center. Give them resources. Give them therapy. Therapy can be a wonderful tool for helping to process traumas. And in any population, it's really important to implement healthy lifestyle habits in general and try and instill the importance of these in the next generation. Oftentimes, people of lower socioeconomic are the ones that go through the most traumas. They're the ones that have the least access to food. They're the ones that are working jobs that don't allow them the free time to get exercise. So we always push for the importance of a healthy diet, trying to get exercise, stress reduction, and getting good sleep, because those are the things that help your mental health the most at baseline. Those are the evidence-based measures that anyone and everyone can do to better their mental health. And that's not always possible in those populations. We want to be aware of that because they are under so much socioeconomic stress. But trying to promote those healthy habits and giving people a way to have those habits in the future, we think is such an important thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we kind of talked about it last episode of just like the importance of like small steps, small changes are more attainable. Trying to change something greatly overnight is gonna leave you feeling discouraged. It's gonna leave you feeling like it's not possible. But trying to have like a culture, basically, whether that's if you're a teacher in your classroom, if you work at a school, in the school, a culture of in your clinic that you work at, whatever profession you're in, having a culture of like these positive ways to take care of yourself and positive lifestyle changes can not only help with like coping and not only help with someone's overall mental health and well-being, but can help with how they process certain things and how they deal with significant impacts that they've had.
Yes, dude, so right.
Ooh, on fire. Well, as much as we'd love to talk forever, we do got to wrap us up a little bit. We're going to hit you with some take-home points. The first one being generational trauma is an area of scientific research that started with studying families who had gone through the Holocaust.
Generational trauma leads to changes both psychologically, socially, and epigenetically that can impact multiple generations down the line.
The main way to overcome generational trauma is to be aware that it happens, support families who have been through tough, traumatic events, and being aware of historical trauma that may be impacting the people around you.
And always, as a general rule, spread as much love and be as supportive as possible. It's so easy to get into the negative mindset of someone struggling. Oh, it's their choices that have put them there. But that doesn't really help anyone.
Yeah.
It's important to try and think of, oh, someone's struggling. How can I support them? How can I lift them up? We can make this world a better place together.
There it is. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for riding with us and rocking with us. We're going to leave you all with the same, maybe not the same. I feel like I change it once in a while. With a similar message that we tell you every single time. If you enjoyed what you heard today, we have a ton more episodes. I don't even know what number we're on at this point, but you can find our episodes wherever you get your podcasts. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, feel free to leave us a 5-star review. You can also leave us a comment if you would like. On Spotify, you can leave us a 5-star review. We would love that. You can find us on social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, at Millennial MHC. I think even on YouTube, that's our handle, at Millennial MHC. We're on the YouTube too. You can and watch us interact with each other if you don't just want to listen. Email us too if you'd like it's millennialmhchannel@gmail.com. I've talked enough. Justin has talked enough. We are done for today. Thank you all for listening. And as always, like the great Marshawn Lynch once said, take care of y'all mentals.